Welcome to See Crime Stories, true stories of the missing and the pursuit of answers. It starts the way these stories so often do, not with sirens, but with a quiet place and a family trying to enjoy an ordinary day. Today, Maple Ridge, Oregon, is the kind of town you can drive past in minutes, a mill on one end, a few blocks of shops in the middle, and thick evergreens pressing in on every side. Ask around long enough, though, and one name still comes up in lowered voices: Eli Rowan, the boy who went to the lake and never came home. To understand what happened out there, we have to go back to the summer of 1987. David and Karen Rowan were a working-class couple trying to keep their footing in a mill town that lived and died on lumber orders. David handled maintenance at the mill, the kind of job where a missed bolt or a loose belt could shut down a whole shift. Karen split her time between home and the local elementary school, helping in classrooms and teaching music a few afternoons a week. Their world was small but steady, paychecks that covered the basics, the same pew at church, the same grocery store, the same worn couch where they watched the evening news. At the center of that world was their 7-year-old son, Eli. He wasn't the kind of kid who filled a room with noise. Teachers would later describe him as observant, the boy who watched first and joined in later. At home, he lined up toy cars in perfect rows and could sit for long stretches just watching the way water ran down a window or pooled in the cracks of the sidewalk. That summer, his favorite possession was a bright red plastic boat, a small, shallow toy meant for the edges of a lake or a slow-moving creek. The trip to Cedar Hollow Lake wasn't a big event in their minds. It was a quick overnight, an inexpensive way to give Eli something different to look at besides the mill and the school playground. On a clear July morning, they loaded a cooler, a tent, a bundle of firewood, Karen's camera, and, at Eli's insistence, the red boat. They left Maple Ridge before the sun was high, the truck pushing up into the hills, past logging roads and weathered mailboxes, toward a lake ringed with pines. Cedar Hollow wasn't a resort. It was a state-run campground tucked around a cold, deep lake, with a small check-in booth, a gravel loop road, and a scattering of numbered sites. When the Rowans arrived, the air was bright and warm, and the place was already alive, radios playing low, kids chasing each other between tents, someone grilling near the tree line. They checked in with the ranger, picked a site near the water, and started to unload. Later, investigators would piece together that afternoon using Karen's photographs, witness statements, and the Rowans' own accounts. In those images, you can see the story before it breaks: David kneeling at the shore, driving a stake into the damp ground. A nylon rope tied from that stake to the bow of the red boat. Eli, small in a t-shirt and shorts, sitting proudly inside the boat just a few feet from land. Other shots show him hopping out, splashing in the shallows, the boat bumping gently against the limit of its line. The hours moved slowly. They ate simple sandwiches in the shade, Karen fiddled with the little radio, and Eli drifted between his parents and the shoreline. The sun slid west, throwing a sharper glare across the lake. Families down the way kept doing what families do, tossing a football, turning pages of paperbacks, tending grills that smoked just enough to sting the eyes. Nothing about those moments stood out to the people who were there. Not yet. Sometime later in the afternoon, Karen decided to walk up the path to the restroom, just a short distance, far enough to be out of sight, close enough that she could still hear bits of campground noise. David stayed behind to sort the firewood and reorganize the gear around the tent. Eli settled near the waterline, within easy view, his small hands in the sand, the red boat resting a few feet offshore, rope slack but still secured to the stake. What happens next takes less than the time it takes to stack an armload of wood. By every account, David turned away for a brief moment, long enough to carry a load toward the fire ring, set it down, and turn back. In that short window, the picture changed. The patch of shoreline where Eli had been sitting was empty. The rope that had tethered the boat was no longer tied to the stake. The red boat had drifted out, bobbing gently a short distance from shore, alone. There was no splash anyone remembered. No shout, no cry for help that carried across the campground. The sand around the stake showed only the prints and scuffs you would expect from a day at the lake. For a few seconds, David tried to make sense of it. Maybe Eli had ducked behind the tent or followed his mother up the path. He called his son's name once, then again, louder. When there was no answer, he waded in, grabbed the boat, and scanned the waterline, his voice cutting through the easy afternoon noise that had seemed so normal just minutes before. The calm at Cedar Hollow Lake evaporated. Campers who had been strangers a moment earlier began walking the shoreline, checking behind trees, calling out Eli into the brush. Karen came hurrying back down the path, reading the look on David's face before he could say much more than, "He was right here." The search widened in circles, around the tent, through neighboring sites, up toward the parking area and back. No one could point to the moment the boy vanished. They only knew there was now a space where he should have been. Before long, someone at the ranger station was on the phone to the county. A deputy in a patrol car followed the gravel road down to the loop, parking just beyond the Rowans' campsite. He took in the scene, a family in shock, a cluster of anxious campers, a quiet lake reflecting the trees as if nothing had changed. Then he began the part that would outlast the panic, the notes, the measurements, the first entries in what would become a thick case file. On paper, those first observations looked clean: time of call, time of arrival, weather clear, wind light, visibility good, child missing, last seen at the water's edge with a red plastic boat. But even in those early lines, you can read the contradiction that will carry through this entire story: a disappearance with no witnesses, no struggle, and no obvious path away from that narrow strip of sand. In the next phase, Cedar Hollow Lake will stop being a campground and become a search grid. Divers will enter the water, volunteers will sweep the woods, and every inch of shoreline will be measured, photographed, and logged. But it all begins here, in the space of a few minutes on a bright afternoon, when a family trip turned into a question Maple Ridge has never been able to answer. If cases like this one make you think about your own small town, or about the places you once felt safest, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And if you want to follow this investigation as we move from the shoreline into the case files, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. When deputies from the Maple County Sheriff's Office reach Cedar Hollow Lake, the daylight is already fading. They park along the gravel loop, step out into the lingering smell of charcoal and pine smoke, and walk into a scene that looks more like a family campground than an emergency. But the longer they stand there, the more it's clear: a 7-year-old boy is missing, and no one can explain how. The first order of business is control. A deputy radios in that the lake road needs to be closed. Yellow tape goes up around the Rowan campsite and the strip of shoreline where Eli was last seen. Names and phone numbers are taken from nearby families. Those who are willing stay to help search, others are asked to keep their distance. Flashlights cut through the trees as volunteers spread out along the path to the restrooms, the parking lot, and the edge of the woods. Every few seconds, someone calls Eli and waits, just in case there's an answering voice. Through the night, the search widens but stays methodical. A ranger leads a team along the shore, checking under docks and around large rocks. Others push into the timberline, following game trails and drainage ditches, watching for any sign of small footprints or disturbed brush. On the water, a small boat with a spotlight sweeps slow, overlapping lines across the surface, looking for anything that doesn't belong. The red plastic boat is brought back to shore, tagged, and set aside. Its rope, now cleanly untied, is photographed where it lays. By first light, Cedar Hollow Lake no longer feels like a campground. It's a search grid. More deputies arrive. The sheriff signs off on bringing in the county's dive team, even though the water here is relatively shallow near the shore. Divers pull on gear beside the dock while a supervisor marks a map, dividing the lake into sectors. They drop beneath the surface in tight formation, hands sweeping along the bottom, visibility dropping to almost nothing in the murk and weeds. Above them, an officer in an inflatable boat tracks their bubbles and calls out coordinates. For hours, nothing turns up. No clothing, no shoes, no sign of a body. The water is colder than it looks, but it's calm, with no current strong enough to hide a child without leaving some trace. On land, another team meticulously works the Rowan campsite. They photograph the tent, the cooler, the fire ring, the stake where the boat had been tied. The ground is soft, but there are no deep impressions suggesting a struggle, no clear drag marks leading into the trees or back toward the parking lot. Back at the station, detectives begin building a picture of the family. They separate David and Karen for interviews, taking down their timelines minute by minute. David's account stays consistent: Eli by the water, the boat tethered, a brief turn to stack firewood, and then a hole where his son should have been. Karen's version matches his, down to the route she took up the path and how long she thinks she was gone. Financial checks come next. Payroll from the mill, Karen's school paperwork, bank statements, nothing points to a family in crisis or a sudden plan to leave. There are no new life insurance policies, no hidden accounts, no large purchases. Investigators talk to Eli's teacher and pediatrician. The portrait that emerges is of a quiet, attached child, not someone who runs off or talks about disappearing. At school, he likes routine. At home, he clings to familiar patterns. There's no indication he was being mistreated, and no history of wandering. It all feeds into a conclusion that nobody wants to say out loud: this doesn't look like a boy who simply decided to leave. Even as the paperwork piles up, deputies keep working the human side of the case. They re-interview campers who were closest to the Rowan site. One remembers seeing Eli beside the water earlier in the afternoon, another recalls the red boat bobbing near the shoreline. But no one saw a stranger approach the boy, no one heard tires spin on the gravel road, no one remembers a commotion that would alert the whole campground. License plates from parked vehicles are recorded and run. None match any open warrants or prior abduction cases. After several days, the physical search begins to shrink. The divers have covered every section of Cedar Hollow Lake that could conceivably hide a body that size and have found nothing. Dogs brought in to search the tree line lose the scent at roughly the same point every time, just above the water's edge. Weather reports are added to the file: clear skies, light wind, no storms, no unusual currents. On paper, at least, nature offers no easy explanation. Inside the sheriff's office, the tone shifts from urgent to resigned. Investigators gather around a conference table with maps, photos, and the initial incident reports spread out in front of them. They know what the public wants: an answer. The simplest one, the one that makes the most sense to people who weren't there, is drowning. A tragic accident in a place where children are allowed to play near the water. With no body and no clear evidence of a crime, that's the category the case is eventually given: presumed drowning, body not recovered. But not everyone is satisfied. In the margins of some of those reports, a different word shows up: unresolved. The boat rope, clearly untied and not broken. The lack of physical trace in the lake. The absence of a single witness who can say what they saw in those crucial minutes. Those details don't point to a neat theory, but they're enough to keep a few people uneasy. The Rowan family goes home to a house that suddenly feels too quiet. Friends and neighbors bring casseroles, offer rides, sit in silence when there's nothing left to say. David returns to the mill, clocking in on time but working like a man moving underwater. Karen stops going to the grocery store during the day. She can't stand the way conversations fall off when she walks down an aisle. In Maple Ridge, life keeps rolling: paychecks, school days, church services, but a gap has opened that no one can close. As the years move on, the physical file slides from an active drawer to a cold case cabinet. The red toy boat stays in an evidence box, its plastic faded, the rope coiled beside it. On paper, the Rowan case has an official label, a box checked, a line added to a list of closed investigations. Off paper, the question remains: if the lake didn't give up a body, and the woods didn't offer a trail, what really happened at Cedar Hollow that afternoon? It will take nearly 18 years, and a single piece of lab data from hundreds of miles away, to crack that file back open. And when it does, it won't come from the shoreline or the woods around Maple Ridge. It will come from a tube of donated blood and a DNA match that no one in that 1987 search could have imagined. By 2005, the Rowan file is just one more gray box on a metal shelf. The label still reads missing child, presumed drowning, but in practical terms, Eli's case has gone quiet. Cedar Hollow Lake is a story older deputies tell the new ones on slow nights, a mystery with no body, no suspect, and no real way forward. The break doesn't come from Maple Ridge. It doesn't come from a late confession or a hunter finding something in the woods. It starts in a glass office tower hundreds of miles away, on a weekday morning that no one there thinks is remarkable. At a mid-sized tech company, employees line up for a workplace blood drive. There are free t-shirts, donuts, and a folding table with consent forms. Among the donors is a 24-year-old software technician named Caleb Miles. He signs his name, cracks a nervous joke about needles, and extends his arm. The nurse fills a labeled tube, hands him a cup of orange juice, and moves on to the next person. For Caleb, it's over in minutes. For the system his blood is about to enter, it's just beginning. At a regional lab, those tubes are sorted, scanned, and logged. As part of a standard process, selected samples are converted into DNA profiles, strings of numbers representing specific markers. Most of the time, those profiles live quietly in medical databases. But in certain states, there are agreements that allow limited cross-checking against national missing person and unidentified remains files. It's not designed to solve cold cases. It's designed to avoid mix-ups, to flag anomalies. One night, a technician sees an alert pop up on her screen. A newly processed donor profile is showing a near-perfect alignment with an old entry in the National Missing Children database. The missing file is from Oregon. The name attached to it is one she's never heard before, Eli Rowan, reported missing in 1987 from a place called Maple Ridge. At first, she assumes it's noise, corrupted data, a partial match. She reruns the comparison. The same result appears. The statistical probability is overwhelming. She calls her supervisor. The supervisor calls the state lab. Within a matter of days, a formal notification is on its way to the Maple County Sheriff's Office. In Maple County, Detective Sergeant Monica Hayes has spent years working a mix of current cases and old ones. When the message lands on her desk, DNA match, potential identification of missing child Rowan, Eli, 1987, she reads it twice. Then she walks down to the evidence room. The Rowan box is the same as she remembers from training: faded photos, handwritten reports, a plastic bag with lake sand sealed inside. And near the bottom, the red toy boat, more pink than red now, its rope coiled beside it. Monica requests the original reference samples that David and Karen Rowan gave in the late 80s and orders fresh testing. If this match is real, she wants it verified on their end, not just through an out-of-state alert. When the lab results come back, they leave little room for doubt. The donor profile from the blood drive, labeled Miles, Caleb, is consistent with being the biological child of David and Karen. The boy who vanished at Cedar Hollow Lake appears to be alive, living under another name. The next step is coordination. Monica contacts law enforcement in the state where Caleb lives. On paper, he looks unremarkable: steady employment, no criminal record, a rented apartment in a quiet neighborhood. His birth certificate lists another state as his birthplace. His mother is named as Janet Miles. There is no mention of Oregon, Maple Ridge, or the Rowans. Detectives ask Caleb to come in for an interview, framing it as a follow-up on the blood drive. He agrees. In a small conference room, he looks more confused than anything, a young man who's not sure why two detectives from another department are suddenly interested in his childhood. He answers their questions as best he can. He says he grew up in a different state, that his earliest memories start around age 9. Before that, things are blurry: a kitchen with yellow walls, the smell of something cooking, a woman's voice calling him Mikey or Cal. When they finally tell him that his DNA matches a missing child from Oregon, he laughs at first, then stops when he realizes they're serious. "I've never even been there," he says. They show him a black and white photo, a boy on a lakeshore, squinting against the sun, holding a small red plastic boat. Caleb leans in, studying the curve of the hull, the way the rope is tied. "That boat," he says quietly. "I've seen one like that. I don't know where." Back in Oregon, Monica and the prosecutor know what this means. The Rowan file is no longer just a missing person case. It may be a child abduction and long-term concealment. But to prove that, they need more than a DNA match. They need a trail. They turn to the woman listed on Caleb's documents, Janet Miles. She's in her 50s now, working part-time, living in a modest house that doesn't stand out on her street. In her first interview, she insists she did nothing wrong. She says she took in a boy informally in the early 1990s from a man she describes as someone trying to help after a tragedy. There were no court papers, no adoption agency. It was a favor, she says. He told me the child's parents were gone, and he needed someone who could give him a stable home. With a search warrant, investigators go through her attic. In a taped cardboard box, under old blankets, they find items that don't match Caleb's official timeline: small shirts, a worn backpack with faded initials that line up with ER, and other pieces that look like they belong to a younger version of the man downstairs. They're photographed, bagged, and sent to the lab. Traces of DNA on the fabric are compared again. The result is the same. They link back to the Rowan family. Then there's the money. Bank records show occasional deposits into Janet's account in the years after she says the boy arrived. Each deposit is just under a reporting threshold. The source accounts trace back to a man using the name Aaron Pike, someone with spotty employment records, short-term rentals, and no clear current address. He appears in motel logs and job files, then disappears from the paper trail. Individually, none of these elements tell the full story. Together, they outline something chilling: a child taken from a lakeshore, passed through the hands of a drifter, and placed into a life built on altered documents and partial truths. By the time Monica finishes assembling the timeline, 1987 disappearance, 1990s arrival at Janet's house, 2005 DNA hit, she has enough to move the Rowan case out of the cold case cabinet and onto her active caseload. The prosecutor agrees. Officially, the file is reclassified as a non-homicide abduction and identity concealment case. For David and Karen, the news comes in a quiet meeting at the sheriff's office. There are no cameras, no reporters. Just two parents, older now, listening as Monica explains what the lab has found, who Caleb is, and what it means. Their son is alive. He has a different name, a different history, and nearly 2 decades of memories that don't include them. In that moment, the case changes shape. Cedar Hollow Lake is no longer only the site of a presumed drowning. It's the starting point of a hidden life that law enforcement is only now beginning to map. And as Monica looks at the red toy boat in its evidence bag one more time, she knows the next chapter won't be about how Eli disappeared. It will be about what it means for everyone involved now that he's been found. By the summer of 2005, the Rowan file looks different on paper, even if the questions feel the same. The old label, missing child, presumed drowning, has been crossed out in neat handwriting. In its place, victim located alive. Suspected child abduction and concealment. It's the kind of change that looks simple in a case management system. In real life, it's anything but. Inside the Maple County Sheriff's Office, Detective Sergeant Monica Hayes spreads out everything they now know across a conference table: the DNA reports linking Caleb Miles to David and Karen Rowan, the artifacts from Janet Miles's attic, the bank statements tied to a man called Aaron Pike. Across from her, the county prosecutor goes line by line, deciding what can be proven and what has to remain an educated inference. They agree on the core. Janet didn't take Eli from Cedar Hollow Lake, but she did accept a child with no paperwork, built a life on false records, and took money over the years to keep it that way. The charges will reflect that: concealment, falsified documents, not the kidnapping everyone once imagined when they looked out over the lake. At the same time, another process is taking shape in a quieter room, planning the first meeting between Caleb and the Rowans. Counselors brief both sides on what to expect. Caleb is warned that the couple he's about to meet has carried a picture of him as a 7-year-old for nearly 2 decades. David and Karen are reminded that the man who will walk through that door is not stepping back into 1987. He has a different name, a different history, and no obligation to feel what they feel. The message is simple and hard: this is not a reunion that fixes the past, it's an introduction in the present. The meeting happens in a neutral conference space at the sheriff's office, walls bare except for a clock and a framed map of the county. There are no cameras. Only Monica, a counselor, and a quiet deputy outside the door. Caleb arrives first, sitting at one end of the table, hands folded, eyes on the paperwork in front of him. When the door opens again, David and Karen step in together. They look older than the photo he's seen, grayer, slower, but something in the way they stand side by side is familiar. What passes between them isn't television drama. It's hesitant and careful. Karen takes a seat, then reaches across the table, not quite touching his hand. "You look well," she says, her voice thin but steady. David studies him for a long second and finally manages one question. "They're sure?" Monica nods. "The science is as close to certain as it gets." Caleb doesn't cry. He doesn't suddenly remember Cedar Hollow Lake or Maple Ridge. What he feels, he later admits, is something closer to vertigo, a sense that there's an entire chapter of his life that other people remember for him. Outside that room, the case against Janet moves forward. In court filings, prosecutors outline the pattern: a child delivered to her in the early 1990s by a man using the name Aaron Pike, no legal adoption, no attempt to verify his story, and a series of deposits that suggest an ongoing agreement to keep the boy where he was. Her attorney counters that she gave him stability, that she believed what she was told, that the parents were gone and no one else was coming. On the stand, she repeats a version of the same line: "I thought I was doing the right thing." Investigators aren't done with Pike. Monica and a small team chase what's left of his paper trail: thin employment records from the late 80s, a mechanic's certification that was never renewed, motel logs where someone with his name paid cash for long stays. Every lead ends the same way: a last address, a final paycheck, then nothing. There is no arrest warrant with his name on it, no confirmed death certificate, no fingerprint card in any current system. Pike becomes what he has effectively been since 1987, an outline with no face the public will ever see. By 2006, the Rowan case reaches the point every long investigation eventually hits: administrative closure. Monica signs off on a final summary noting that the victim has been identified alive, that charges related to concealment have been filed against Janet, and that the suspected abductor remains unlocated. The file is moved from her active caseload to a shelf reserved for cases that are, in the language of the office, resolved to the extent possible. The red plastic boat stays in its evidence box, its color faded, rope still coiled neatly beside it, a reminder that not every artifact leads to the kind of answers you can put in a closing memo. Life, in its own way, moves on. Caleb keeps his job but steps back from social circles that suddenly see him as a headline instead of a coworker. He spends some weekends in Maple Ridge, sitting with David and Karen at their kitchen table, paging through family albums that feel like someone else's childhood. Other weeks, he goes home and keeps his distance, trying to figure out how much space there is between loyalty to the woman who raised him and the truth about where he came from. For David, the hardest part is accepting that there is no moment of getting him back in the way he once imagined. There is only this, an adult son with a life already in motion. Karen focuses on smaller things, learning his routines, hearing about his work, asking for pictures of the place he lives now. "I can't ask him to remember something he doesn't," she tells Monica quietly. "I'm just glad he's somewhere I can call." Janet serves her sentence and then, eventually, fades from the public record. Some in Maple Ridge will always see her as a villain, others, as a woman who made a series of devastatingly bad decisions in a time when systems for tracking children were easier to manipulate. Officially, her case becomes one more entry in a court ledger. Unofficially, her choices sit at the center of every debate about what should have been done differently. And then there's Cedar Hollow Lake. Today, it looks much like it did in 1987, water catching the light, campsites scattered along the bank, a ranger at the entrance kiosk. Most visitors have never heard of Eli Rowan. For those who have, the place never quite returned to normal. On certain evenings, you can still see flowers tucked near a tree at the shoreline, or a small toy boat left on a rock, the way someone might leave a question with no expectation of an answer. In the end, the Rowan story doesn't offer the kind of closure that fits neatly into a single word. The missing boy is alive, but the man who took him is still a question mark. The file is closed, But the people who lived it carry their own private versions of what justice and mercy look like here. As you think about this case, about a disappearance with no body, a discovery made by a lab machine, and a life split between two names, we'd like to hear from you. Do you think justice was done? What does being found really mean in a story like this? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments, and let us know what cases you'd like us to explore next.